The story of Simon of Cyrene is a powerful account of sacrifice, transformation, and redemption. A common man who, unintentionally, became involved in the final moments of Jesus, Simon stands as a direct witness to one of the most significant events in human history. Through his eyes, we are invited to reflect on the profound love and sacrifice that shaped the destiny of humanity. On this journey, we will see how an unexpected encounter can completely change the course of a life. Subscribe now. Join us on this journey of faith and reflection, and don't miss the upcoming chapters of this impactful story. May the Passion of Christ touch your heart, just as it did Simon's. It was a warm spring morning when Simon of Cyrene arrived in Jerusalem. He had traveled from his hometown, Cyrene, located in the region of North Africa, with the purpose of participating in the Passover celebration. As a devout man, Simon had always dreamed of being in the Holy City on such an important occasion. However, he could never have imagined that his destiny would intersect so dramatically with the events that were about to unfold in those very streets. The city of Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims. The streets were crowded with people who, like him, had come from different parts of the Jewish world to fulfill the laws and traditions of their people. The bustle of voices and the sounds of animals brought by travelers for sacrifices blended with the aroma of food prepared for the rituals. Yet, despite the festive atmosphere, Simon could not shake the feeling that there was something different in the air, as if something monumental was about to happen. As he walked through the narrow alleyways of the city, dressed in his travel tunic and hat, Simon noticed that the murmurs of the people were growing louder. A rumor was spreading rapidly among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Jesus of Nazareth has been condemned. Simon did not know who this Jesus was, but something in the way people spoke about him piqued his curiosity. Nevertheless, Simon had a mission in the city and intended to continue on his way to the temple, where he would offer his prayers and sacrifices. However, fate had other plans for Simon. As he walked toward the center of the city, a crowd surrounded him. The tumult of people pushed and pulled, and suddenly a group of Roman soldiers came into view, leading a man who was chained and beaten. Jesus, the man everyone was talking about, was on his knees. His face was covered in blood, his body weakened by wounds and exhaustion. The soldiers, with the characteristic harshness of the Romans, showed no compassion toward him. The Romans showed no compassion toward him, and the crowd, which mostly watched him with contempt, hurled insults and threats. Simon, bewildered by the scene, stopped as he saw the evident suffering of this man. But the confusion and curiosity soon turned into something much deeper as he observed Jesus. A Roman soldier approached him with a cold stare, and without saying a word, pointed at him. "You, come here," the soldier ordered. Before Simon could react, he was shoved forward, forced to take the wooden cross that Jesus was carrying, destined to be taken to Golgotha. Simon tried to protest, but his resistance was futile. The soldiers, impatient, made him take the heavy beam and place it on his shoulders. Jesus, already exhausted from the long journey to Golgotha, could barely walk. The crowd kept pushing, shouting and jeering as they moved toward the place of crucifixion. Sweat began to drip from Simon's forehead as he felt the weight of the cross on his shoulders. He had never imagined that, on this Passover journey, he would become involved in something so grim. From being a common man, he was that day dragged by fate into a scene that would change his life forever. At that moment, Simon did not understand the magnitude of what was happening. He did not know who this Jesus truly was, or why his life was now intertwined with his, but he felt a strange sense of compassion in his heart and, at the same time, a growing intrigue. As he walked alongside Jesus, Simon could not help but glance at him from time to time. The harshness of the Romans contrasted with the serenity, though marked by suffering, of this man. Jesus, with his eyes filled with pain, lifted his gaze toward the sky as if seeking comfort from his heavenly Father. Simon did not know what the future held for him, but he did know that on that day in the streets of Jerusalem, his life had changed irreversibly. The cross he now bore on his shoulders was not just a physical burden, but also a foreshadowing of the events to come, of a divine destiny he could not yet fathom. As Simon carried the cross through the dusty streets of Jerusalem, the weight of the wood on his shoulders seemed to grow heavier with every step. Around him, the crowd followed, some mocking, others looking on indifferently, and a few watching in horror at what was happening. The people who had earlier been celebrating Passover were now part of a distant spectacle, yet all were drawn to the presence of this man called Jesus, who, with each step, drew closer to his fateful destiny. Simon, who at first had been bewildered, began to feel the weight of the moment. Initially, he thought his task was just a minor accident, something that would quickly pass. However, as they continued, the gravity of the event became increasingly evident. Jesus, on the other hand, was on the brink of exhaustion. His face, marked by the suffering of scourging and mockery, reflected a strange peace, almost unreachable for those who observed him. The Roman soldiers, with their habitual brutality, pushed and struck Jesus to make him move forward, but he no longer had the strength to keep pace. Nearly collapsing, one of the soldiers, tired of seeing Jesus stagger, ordered someone else to take the cross and carry it for him. It was then that Simon's eyes met those of the soldiers. He had tried to avoid it, but the pressure of the situation, the crowd, and the harshness of the Romans forced him to comply. Simon, who had been observing from the sidelines, now found himself at the center of the action. The cross that Jesus was supposed to carry was now his burden. Jesus, who had stumbled and fallen several times, could no longer move forward. His body's strength no longer responded to his will, and each step seemed more painful than the last. Jesus' condemnation was sealed at that moment, not only through physical torture, but also by social rejection. The crowd, which had once praised him, now condemned him with their indifference. He had been arrested under false accusations, and the religious leaders saw him as a threat. But the real reason for his condemnation ran much deeper. Jesus was condemned for speaking of a kingdom different from that of men, for challenging the established power, and for proclaiming a love that transcended all barriers. As Simon carried the cross on his shoulders, he began to overhear fragments of conversations among the onlookers. Some mocked Jesus, others cursed him for his words, while some simply watched in confusion. Yet, as the journey lengthened and the crowd grew denser, Simon started to feel a strange connection with the man ahead of him. Despite the violence surrounding him, the condemnation that Jesus faced was not only physical, but also emotional. The mockery and rejection of the people seemed to wound him more deeply than the lashes and blows. Nevertheless, his serenity did not go unnoticed by Simon. As they walked, the silence of Jesus, amidst the shouting and clamor of the crowd, was what struck Simon the most. In that moment, he began to wonder, who is this man? What has he done to deserve such torture? Simon was not a man of great religious learning. His life in Cyrene had been simple. He was a family man, a man of the people. He had never heard of Jesus before, and up until that moment, he had not been interested in the stories coming from Galilee. But as he walked alongside him, something inside Simon began to change. The peace and dignity that emanated from Jesus were bewildering. How could someone remain so serene in the face of such suffering? What kind of man could bear so much pain without uttering a word of complaint? The cross Simon carried was not just a physical burden, The contact with that wooden beam, which now tied his fate to Jesus, connected him in an inexplicable way to the events unfolding around him. As he walked, Simon felt that somehow his life would never be the same again. He was no longer just a passive observer of Christ's passion. Somehow he had become an involuntary participant, a witness to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The road to Golgotha, the place of crucifixion, was long and tortuous. The crowd followed Jesus and Simon, some muttering words of hatred, others simply watching as if it were all part of a spectacle. But for Simon, each step took him farther away from the life he once knew and closer to the mystery of the Passion. Meanwhile, Jesus kept moving forward, his eyes fixed on the horizon with a gaze that reflected not hatred but deep understanding. He seemed to know that the weight of his cross was not only physical but also spiritual, and that despite his pain, he was bearing the burden of all humanity. Simon did not know it yet, but that day, under the scorching sun of Jerusalem, his life was about to change forever. The blistering heat of the afternoon bore down on Jerusalem as Simon continued walking through the narrow streets, carrying Jesus' cross. His shoulders already felt the sharp pain of the wood's weight, and the people around him seemed relentless in their jeers and mockery. The mocking laughter of the Roman soldiers echoed in his ears, while the crowd, mostly curious onlookers, stared at him. Simon could barely see beyond the chaos, but he felt a growing discomfort. The cross, placed upon him as an obligation by the soldiers, seemed to bear not only the physical weight of his body, but also the weight of what was happening around him. As he walked, sweat ran down his face, and his tunic clung to his skin. Each step became increasingly heavier, and Simon feared that his strength would give out under the weight of the cross. He was a strong man, accustomed to physical labor, but he had never experienced exhaustion like this. Every step was a struggle, and yet his mind could not disconnect from the image of Jesus. Jesus walked ahead of him, his head bowed, as if his body no longer had the strength to lift it. Simon could hear the whispers of the people around him, commenting on the condemned man. Some called him the King of the Jews, others cursed him, and a few looked at him with pity. But what caught Simon's attention the most were not the words of the crowd, but the figure of Jesus. What captivated him was the serenity on Jesus' face, despite the brutality with which the soldiers treated him and the evident pain reflected in his battered body. Something in his eyes conveyed an unshakable peace, as if everything happening had a purpose beyond what people could see. The cross Simon carried was no ordinary burden. It was not just the weight of the wood, but also the weight of a destiny about to be fulfilled. As he advanced through the dusty streets, Simon could not help but wonder how it was possible for this man, so wounded, so mistreated, to maintain composure and calm in the midst of such torment. Simon did not understand. He could not comprehend the suffering he was witnessing. Yet no words of protest came from his lips. Something within him kept him silent, as if a greater force was guiding him at that moment. His thoughts shifted from the physical pain to a deeper reflection. What had this man done to deserve such a fate? Why was a figure so serene, so full of love, being condemned so cruelly? As they moved closer to Golgotha, Simon could not help but feel a mix of fear and admiration. The fate of Jesus seemed sealed, but something inside Simon told him there was more at stake than what met the eye. This was not just a condemned man, but someone who seemed far greater than any other human being. With every step Jesus took, he seemed closer to his destiny. And though Simon did not know him deeply, he was beginning to understand that his participation in this event was no mere coincidence. The weight of the cross bore heavily on him, yes, but at the same time he felt that something bound him to this man, something far beyond a simple physical burden. Golgotha, at the edge of the city, seemed to draw closer slowly. With every step, Simon felt more involved, more connected to the suffering and sacrifice that Jesus was about to face. The crowd, which had been gathering around them, grew denser. The murmurs grew louder, and the voices of the Roman soldiers mixed with those of the onlookers, who watched in silence or sadness. The sense of anguish was palpable, but so was a strange impression that everything happening had a greater purpose. Simon no longer saw the cross as just a piece of wood he carried on his shoulders. Now he felt that this timber was the means by which a divine destiny was about to unfold. Each step toward Golgotha made Simon feel more involved, more connected to the suffering and sacrifice Jesus was about to endure. As they approached the place of crucifixion, a profound silence began to envelop the crowd. Those who had been noisy and boisterous started to quiet down, as if the gravity of the moment had finally reached them. The moment seemed to silence everyone. The soldiers began to prepare the site for what was about to occur. Golgotha, with its barren hill and somber atmosphere, was the place where those condemned by the Roman Empire met their end. Yet Simon, deep within, knew that what was about to happen was not merely the end of one man, but the beginning of something far greater. The cross, now unbearably heavy on his shoulders, reminded Simon that he had been chosen for a purpose he did not yet fully understand. However, something within him told him that, in some way, he was part of something sacred, something that transcended the boundaries of his comprehension. His journey from Cyrene, which had begun as a simple act of devotion, had transformed into a testimony that would mark him forever. The arrival at Golgotha was near. As the path came to its end, Simon felt for the first time that he was not just a man walking through the streets of Jerusalem. He was a witness to the Passion, a man whose life, for reasons he still could not grasp, had become intertwined with the suffering and redemption of the man called Jesus. Golgotha was before them, an arid and desolate terrain that rose as a dark stage for what was about to unfold. The crowd, which had followed Simon and Jesus the entire way, began to scatter around the site. Some approached the edge of the hill, while others lingered at a distance, watching expectantly. The Roman soldiers quickly began to organize, and the atmosphere filled with palpable tension, as if the very air sensed the magnitude of the moment. Simon, exhausted from the effort of carrying the cross to that place, felt his body trembling under the weight of the wood and the anguish of the situation. His legs ached, his arms were numb, yet for some reason he could not take his eyes off Jesus. The crowd, which had once cheered and scorned him equally, now stood in silence, as if a mantle of solemnity had fallen over everyone. Jesus, still bearing the cross on his shoulders, was on the verge of collapse. The Romans surrounded him and, without ceremony, began to strip him of his clothes. The harshness of the soldiers' actions stood in stark contrast to the calm on Jesus' face. Simon could not comprehend how this was possible. Jesus, who had been mercilessly beaten and tortured, maintained a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. In the distance, the echoes of the crowd shouting, "Crucify him," still rang in Simon's ears, but he could only focus on the figure of Jesus. Suddenly, Simon was separated from Jesus as the soldiers began to prepare the site for the crucifixion. A soldier shoved him roughly, ordering him to step aside. Simon, speechless, stepped back but did not avert his gaze. It was then that Jesus, passing near him, lifted his eyes to meet Simon's. It was not a look of fury or despair, but one that was deep and penetrating, filled with a peace that seemed to encompass everything. It was a look that reflected immense pain, but also an unshakable peace. Jesus' eyes met Simon's for a brief yet eternal moment, and something in that instant changed the man from Cyrene completely. Simon could not help but feel that gaze piercing his soul, as if Jesus, with all his suffering, was looking not just at him, but at all of humanity. In those eyes, Simon saw not only physical pain, but something much greater, something that transcended human suffering. It was a gaze filled with forgiveness, acceptance, and profound compassion without limits. In that brief moment, Simon felt that the weight of the cross on his shoulders was no longer just a physical burden, but a shared one. Jesus' suffering became his own, and at the same time, something within him began to change. The gaze of Jesus, so full of suffering, was not the gaze of a defeated man. Simon saw in it a strength that surpassed all understanding. Though everything seemed lost, though death was near, that gaze conveyed that love and sacrifice would never be in vain. Something in Simon's heart trembled at this revelation. He had never before experienced anything so profound, so human, and at the same time, so divine. As the soldiers continued their work, driving nails into Jesus' hands and feet, Simon stood there, paralyzed, watching. The sound of the hammers and the shouts of the crowd seemed to fade from his mind, as though the entire universe had been suspended in that moment. The figure of Jesus, now lifted upon the cross, dominated the scene. And although Simon was physically distant from him, he felt that his soul was somehow bound to the cross in a way he could not describe. The soldiers finished securing Jesus to the cross, and the body of the Master hung suspended in the middle of Golgotha. The crowd, which had earlier followed every step of the condemned man, now watched in an almost reverent silence. A faint murmur spread across the hill, but Simon could not take his eyes off Jesus. He felt that something transcendental was happening, though he could not fully comprehend it. In the distance, the first shadows of dusk began to fall over the sky, and the scene of the crucifixion became even more solemn under the dim light of the dying day. Simon, with his heart still pounding, stepped a little closer to Golgotha. Somehow, without knowing exactly why, he felt that his life would never be the same again. He felt he needed to be there, near this man who had looked at him with such love and mercy. Despite the horror of the situation, something within him told him that he could not walk away. The image of Jesus hanging on the cross began to etch itself into Simon's mind. In that broken, bleeding body, Simon saw something beyond the visible. The crucifixion was not merely an execution, it was an act of supreme love, something he could never fully comprehend, but was beginning to accept. The silence, Jesus' gaze, and the fullness of human suffering intertwined in Simon's heart, marking a before and after in his life. Though Simon did not yet understand everything that was happening, the encounter with Jesus' gaze had touched the deepest fibers of his being. In that moment, without words, without explanations, something within him had begun to transform. Jesus, the man whose cross he had carried, was now transforming him, and there was nothing Simon could do but remain there, watching. That gaze, more than any words, had revealed the reality of sacrifice, a love so profound that neither pain nor death could separate it from humanity. For the first time, Simon understood that Jesus' cross was not merely a punishment, but an act of redemption for all. The wind had begun to blow more fiercely as the soldiers completed their grim task. Jesus hung from the cross, his body torn, his arms stretched wide, and his legs bent, trapped in the horrifying torture of the crucifixion. The crowd, which had watched the moment of crucifixion in silence, began murmuring again. Some murmured in grief, others in indifference. The shouts of mockery continued to echo, and the final words of Jesus, though barely audible, were lost in the air, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. Simon stood on the edge of Golgotha, like a spectator caught in a scene he had not chosen to witness, but somehow knew he needed to see. Deep within his being, something he had ignored until then began to awaken. Simon stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the figure of Jesus. Jesus' face, marked by blood and suffering, seemed to reflect nothing but pain. Yet that pain, though human, seemed to go beyond the physical. In Jesus' eyes, which sought the heavens, Simon saw an intensity difficult to describe. It was as if all the world's suffering was being absorbed by him, as if he was not merely dying, but taking upon himself the weight of all humanity. The horror of the scene was unbearable. The sound of the hammers that had driven the nails into his hands and feet still echoed in Simon's mind. The lament of the crowd, watching as this innocent man suffered under the weight of condemnation, haunted him. Yet something deep and primal within Simon's soul began to react differently. As he observed the image of Jesus suspended between heaven and earth, the pain in Simon's chest began to transform. It was no longer just the suffering of seeing an innocent man die. It was the recognition of a sacrifice that, though incomprehensible, had a purpose far greater than any human understanding. The words of Jesus on the cross began to resonate deeply within Simon. While many in the crowd heard only words of mockery or pain, he perceived something more in what Jesus was saying. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Hearing these words, Simon could not help but shudder. He understood, albeit only partially, that Jesus was not only suffering for those who had crucified him, but for everyone. At that moment, Simon realized that this man, who had carried the cross with such dignity, was not merely dying for him, but for all of humanity. As Simon watched, the last rays of the sun began to fade on the horizon. The sky, which had been clear all day, started to darken. A heavy mantle of darkness began to cover the earth. Simon did not know if this darkness was a sign of what was about to happen, but somehow he felt that not only was the physical world darkening, but the universe itself seemed to be reacting to the magnitude of the act taking place. Jesus, suspended on the cross, continued looking toward the heavens. His words, barely audible, grew weaker as his agonizing breaths became more labored. Simon felt his heart breaking slowly. The pain Jesus was experiencing was not only physical but also spiritual. It was as though he was absorbing the entire burden of sin and human suffering. For Simon, it was incomprehensible how one man could bear such a burden without breaking. Suddenly, a new sensation swept through his body. An inexplicable shudder shook him as he heard the final words of Jesus. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It is finished." Simon did not fully understand what those words meant, but something within him became undeniably clear. Jesus was not merely dying. He was completing something that no man could have achieved on his own. The sacrifice of Jesus was a final act, an act of love that transcended even death itself. With tears blurring his vision, Simon could not take his eyes off the cross. The image of Jesus suspended between heaven and earth seemed to encapsulate everything Simon had experienced up to that moment. His journey from Cyrene and his forced participation in carrying the cross now took on a much deeper meaning. Although he still could not fully comprehend it, the suffering of Jesus had touched the deepest part of Simon's soul, transforming his pain into an inexplicable peace, a peace that he knew he could only fully understand with time. The atmosphere became almost unbearably intense as Jesus finally exhaled his last breath. The earth trembled, The sky grew even darker, and an overwhelming silence fell over the place. The crowd, which had followed the crucifixion with a mix of awe and mockery, now stood mute, as if a great weight had descended upon them all. Simon, with a broken heart and a transformed soul, stood there, motionless and speechless. That day, the weight of the cross had not only fallen upon the shoulders of Jesus, it had touched Simon's soul, marking him forever. From that moment on, the image of Jesus hanging on the cross, his sacrifice, and his unconditional love would become a beacon of light in Simon's life. They would serve as a constant reminder that pain and sacrifice are never in vain, and that through darkness, a redemptive light can always emerge. The silence that had fallen after the death of Jesus became a heavy and dense presence, as if the very air was saturated with infinite sorrow. The earth, which had trembled during Jesus' final breath, seemed to keep resonating in the hearts of those who remained near the cross. Simon could not take his eyes off the figure suspended between heaven and earth. Although Jesus' face was marked by suffering, in that moment there seemed to be something more. There was something about the way Jesus had surrendered himself, something that went beyond the brutality of his execution, something that Simon, despite his pain and confusion, was beginning to sense. As the soldiers approached to confirm that Jesus was dead, the sun began to disappear completely, leaving Golgotha shrouded in deep twilight. Simon stood there, watching, as if the scene of the crucifixion had left an indelible mark on his soul. The crowd, which had initially gathered around the event, began to disperse slowly. Some left in silence, while others spoke among themselves in tones of amazement or disdain. Jesus' disciples, who had stayed on the outskirts of the entire process, approached cautiously, fearful that the storm of hatred against Jesus might also turn on them. But Simon, detached from all of this, was lost in deep reflection. The death of Jesus left an indescribable void. It was not just the death of a man, something far greater had occurred. At that moment, Simon could not fully comprehend what the death of Jesus meant, but he felt that something inside him had been transformed forever. Although his participation in the events leading to the crucifixion had been mostly involuntary, he now felt that his life would never be the same. The image of Jesus on the cross had not only affected him deeply, but it had also connected him to Jesus in a way he could not explain. Jesus' suffering had touched the deepest fibers of his being. Though no tears fell from his eyes, his soul was broken. Simon, a simple man from Cyrene who had come to Jerusalem only to fulfill the Passover rituals, now found himself facing a reality he could never have imagined. This man, who had carried the cross for just a few hours, had shown him the face of a love so profound that it overflowed not only beyond death, but also beyond human suffering itself. Jesus had not only suffered for him, but had also invited him to participate in that suffering. And though Simon did not fully understand what this sacrifice entailed, his heart felt the truth of what he had witnessed. In that moment, Simon understood something fundamental. Jesus had not died for a select group of people, but for all of humanity. He had taken upon himself not only his own burdens, but also the sins of all creation. In his sacrifice, he had included everyone, even Simon, a common man who had been forced to carry his cross. In some way, Jesus' sacrifice was meant to free not only sinners, but also all who could be touched by his story. His death revealed that true love knows no limits, and that suffering, when endured for love, becomes a means of redemption. Simon, his heart still heavy with deep sorrow, began to feel a change within himself. The weight of the cross he had carried for a few hours now seemed to him a living reminder of the sacrifice Jesus had made for everyone. Physically exhausted, he now understood that this burden had not been a mere momentary effort, but a responsibility he was to carry with dignity. How could he, a simple man, be part of such a grand act? How could he begin to comprehend the love Jesus had demonstrated? As he observed Jesus' disciples and the women weeping around him, Simon felt that the love of the crucified man had touched him in a profound and eternal way. When the soldiers began to remove the bodies of the condemned to prepare them for burial, Simon stepped back a little. The disciples, who had been in hiding, began to approach and took Jesus' body. There, near the cross, the beloved disciple and other followers of Jesus prepared his body for the tomb. At that moment, Simon felt that the purpose of his life was beginning to take shape. He had not only been a witness to the crucifixion, but had also been called to participate in something far greater than himself. His encounter with Jesus had not been an accident or mere coincidence. In some way, he too was part of the divine plan. Simon returned to his home in Cyrene without words to describe what he had experienced. The physical distance between Jerusalem and his home seemed overwhelming, but in his heart the journey had been transformative. He knew he would never again look at human suffering in the same way. The death of Jesus, that inexplicable and profound sacrifice, had touched him in a way that would change his life forever. As days passed, Simon came to understand that although he had not been one of Jesus' closest followers, his life was now irrevocably connected to him. Jesus had called him to carry the cross, and in that symbolic act, he had become part of something that transcended his own life. On his return to Cyrene, Simon was no longer just a man who had witnessed the crucifixion. He was a man who had been directly touched by the love of God. What Simon had seen and experienced on the streets of Jerusalem would not easily fade from his heart. On the contrary, the death of Jesus, far from being the end, was the beginning of a deeper understanding of sacrifice and love. As Simon returned to his ordinary life in Cyrene, he knew he carried with him a silent but powerful testimony of the redemptive love that had been revealed on the cross. The journey back to Cyrene was long and lonely for Simon. Although the distance between Jerusalem and his home was significant, what truly weighed on him was not the length of the journey, but the profound impact of what he had witnessed on Golgotha. Every step he took on his way back seemed to distance him physically from the terrible events of the crucifixion, but at the same time, each step brought him closer to a new understanding of himself and his faith. During his journey, Simon found himself in an internal struggle. The image of Jesus on the cross, with his gaze full of love and forgiveness, accompanied him constantly. Despite the distance and the passage of time, the face of Jesus remained vivid in his mind. Simon could not stop thinking about what he had experienced. He had witnessed human suffering in its most brutal form, but he had also witnessed a love so great that it transcended all human understanding. What did all of this mean for him? A common man from Cyrene who had come to Jerusalem by chance. Why had he been chosen to carry the cross, to be part of such a profound and transformative sacrifice? Simon began to wonder if his life could ever be the same again. The peace that Jesus had demonstrated in the midst of his pain, his ability to forgive even those who crucified him, resonated deeply within Simon's soul. In Cyrene, the world seemed to carry on as usual, but within him, something had changed irrevocably. It was not just that he had witnessed the death of a man, he had been a participant in a divine sacrifice, a redemption that extended beyond what the eyes could see. The man who had carried Jesus' cross was no longer the same. Although he did not fully understand the magnitude of what had happened, Simon felt that his life now had a different purpose. The cross was no longer merely a symbol of suffering for him. It had become a constant reminder that through pain and sacrifice, transformation was possible. Jesus' sacrifice was not only for humanity as a whole, but also for him, a man who had been part of that story of redemption. Upon returning to his home, Simon began to share his testimony, not through grand words or sermons, but through his daily life. He knew he did not have the answers to all the questions now stirring in his heart, but something within him told him that the love and sacrifice he had witnessed needed to be reflected in his actions. In this way, he became a silent witness to the passion of Christ. His life, marked by the experience he had lived in Jerusalem, would no longer be an ordinary life. Though he did not seek fame or recognition, his way of living, loving and forgiving spoke louder than any words could. Simon understood that not everyone would have the opportunity to see what he had seen, to stand at Golgotha. However, everyone could experience what he had felt through love and compassion. In every act of kindness toward others, in every moment of sacrifice, Simon found a small reflection of the sacrifice Jesus had made for him. Though he could not return to Jerusalem, he could not forget what Jesus had taught him. That true love is the kind that is given without measure, that is offered without expecting anything in return, that sacrifices itself for the well-being of others. Simon also realized that his testimony did not need to be loud or imposing. The passion of Jesus was not a spectacle to be admired from afar, but an invitation to live differently, to transform life's difficulties into opportunities to love. Like Jesus, Simon understood that it was not about seeking vengeance or earthly justice, but about offering love and forgiveness in every moment, in every action. This love and forgiveness reflected the redemptive sacrifice he had witnessed, a sacrifice that had transformed him forever. It was not just about carrying a physical cross, but about living with a heart willing to forgive, love, and serve. The cross, which had initially been a burden imposed upon him, had now become the symbol of a transformed life, a life that, although marked by suffering, was also filled with hope. As the years passed, Simon continued with his life in Cyrene. Although the story of his encounter with Jesus in Jerusalem stayed with him, it was not something he often shared. However, every time he saw someone suffering or met someone in need of help, Simon remembered the sacrifice he had witnessed. There was no need to speak of it, for his actions said it all. Simon was a changed man, and that transformation was reflected in his daily life. In his heart, he understood that his encounter with Jesus was no coincidence, but part of a divine plan. Though he never fully grasped the implications of that encounter, he knew that his life had been changed forever. Jesus had called him to be a witness to his suffering, but he had also called him to live according to the principles he had taught: unconditional love, forgiveness, humility, and sacrifice. Throughout his life, Simon continued to be a silent witness to the passion of Christ. He did not need to explain it with words, for his life spoke for him. Every act of kindness, every expression of love, and every sacrifice reflected the impact of what he had experienced that day at Golgotha. In the end, Simon realized that although he was not one of the apostles, his participation in the events leading to the crucifixion of Jesus gave him a unique testimony. He was an ordinary man who, unwittingly, had become part of the greatest story humanity would ever know. By living according to the principles of love and sacrifice that Jesus had shown, Simon found his true mission: to be a witness to redemption, a beacon of light for those who had not yet come to know the profound love of God.